everybody. Can you hear me all right in the back there? Yeah? Okay. Greetings to everyone in the far corner. Thank you, Jael, for that very warm introduction and for the invitation. Thank you, Katja, for the brilliant organisation, and all these folks here have done such a great job for us here. Really appreciate it. It's lovely to be with such a great group of people and keep a very close eye on this clock here. So, the project today that I'm going to talk about is a slightly different title and more academic-y sounding one that Jael gave me. Free research practice. What does that mean? It means three things. It means to do free research practice, to practice free research, and in the doing of that, to research free practice. Now that's some of the things that we're doing here today. I think we're doing pretty well on 1 and 3. I'm not so sure how well we're doing on 2. I want to situate this very briefly as part of a trend that I see emerging in what used to be visual culture towards the practice of visual activism. This is a term that I take from the work of ZANELE MUHOLI, who is, as she terms herself, a black lesbian visual activist who works in South Africa, trying to create the possibility of visibility for herself and for other people in her community, at the cost, as you can see if you look at the bottom right-hand slide, of direct physical violence against her and others. So she's engaging in this activism at the direct cost of personal threats to herself and to others. And I see this then as something that, if we live in, as I think we do, a culture that is broadly speaking visual, we can take one or two approaches to it. We can do something that's very clumsily been called visual culture studies, which is to say we study the visual culture, or we can try and change it. And that would be what I'm thinking we're calling visual activism. And I want to draw this back to a moment, and it fits very nicely with what Nina just had to say actually. In North London in 1968 at the Hornsey School of Art, which was occupied by students for 6 weeks, beginning on May 28th, 1968, or the busy couple of months in world history. Perhaps hasn't attracted the same attention as it might have done had it been another time. What happened in the school at that time was that it really became a permanent debating chamber, which they called at the time open democracy. And that's a phrase that continues obviously to resonate very strongly forward to us here today. All kinds of things resulted from that set of discussions. Mostly what has been talked about were a set of kind of very concrete proposals about what to do with art education in the UK. But at the time, the emphasis was, as you can see from the poster on the right-hand side of the screen here, not reform, but what they called revolution. And they're interested in a direct attempt to smash the system. And I want to just show, and let's hope that this works. An excerpt from a film that they made resulting from after the eviction. No, it's not going to work, is it? So it was I knew this was going to happen. It's transferred from Mac to Windows. What the film would have shown you was a demonstration that the students staged in the streets of North London, and they're carrying banners that say, direct democracy works. So that phrase, direct democracy, which has created a lot of resonance around the world since 2011, actually turns out to have quite a long genealogy within directly the art education system. And what Hornsey were claiming was what they called an open network as a model for education, in which students would be empowered to create their own courses, their own pedagogy. And what they produced in addition to this film was called the Hornsey film. You can find it online. There was also a book that was published by Penguin called The Hornsey Affair, collectively authored, collaboratively written. There was an exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London that Nina mentioned a moment ago. And interestingly, the exhibition centered around a reconstruction of the canteen at Hornsey, because the Hornsey folks considered the canteen to be the center of the project. Without the canteen, they couldn't have continued the occupation. And it's exactly the same way that the kitchen was the center of Occupy Wall Street 2 years ago, and as was pointed out this morning, the dining hall was the central focus for Black Mountain College. So it's all about sustainability and mutual aid and thinking about how you might then create the possibility of an alternative. So this was a dynamic utopian visual rhetoric that they created, very much in keeping, obviously, with 1968 in the global sense, but also a prefiguration of what's been happening more recently, other later occupations. And so we want to, I think, bear in mind then this idea of smash the system. We want to remember that out of Hornsey, which then became incorporated into what is now Middlesex University, was the first degree course in visual culture in 1989, and a journal that some of you may remember called Block, which was one of the first attempts to theorize feminist and Marxist approaches to visual culture. But I want to also say that as much as we can see these continuities to that past 50 years ago, we don't live in the same world that they did. And this is obvious in a number of ways. But I have this little mantra which says that we live on a young, urban, hot, wired planet. Which is to say, the majority of the world's population is now under 30. The majority of the world's population, for the first time in human history, lives in cities or other urban spaces. 2.5 billion people have access to the internet. By the end of this decade, that's projected to be 5 billion people, which will mean that we have the first not mass medium, but universal medium. And of course, we live in this era of climate change, which means that the largest single artwork in existence is the planet that we're on. It's entirely now human-made. So all of those things, as we'll see resonating throughout what I'm going to try and say here, create the need for something that, of course, recalls what happened previously, but also needs to be very different. What we do, I think, see emerging are collective forms of free practice, structured around collaboration, skill share, cost share, free exchange, and activism. So these are new forms being built in the shell of the old. They do not constitute a new system, and I think they don't want to do that. And I think that, in that sense, something like Bologna is simply something you have to actively contest and resist, but not directly to seek to modify. And much of this is centered around the question of space, as we already heard very interestingly earlier this morning. We think about the ways in which we learned to create, hold, and keep open space from Tahrir to Zuccotti Park to Gezi, and maybe even to the Maidan in Kiev. Keeping space open is the means to free practice. And that was known at the time as the movement of squares. And there was a really interesting resonance with what you had to say earlier this morning, that the square is a potentially radical form, because it's equal. Each side is equal to the other. So I want to call these spaces parasites. And I mean that in the sense that Occupy and other square movements were parasitical, and that they occupied space that was not their own. When we went to Wall Street, we didn't want to be part of Wall Street, we wanted to occupy it. A parasite is also, in the traditional sense of para, it's beside or beyond an existing site. So it seeks to then transform that space. And it draws on and redistributes the resources of older institutions, the places that we are parasitical upon. I take the name from a small gallery in Hong Kong. It's called Parasite. It's tiny but critical space in civil society, in the dynamic space of Hong Kong as the city transitions from direct colonialism to the authoritarian state capitalism of mainland China, but has this extraordinary transition from now till 2046. As Michel Sarès once noted, the parasite is then a form of disorder that generates a new form of potential order. So the parasite is a transitional form, and it's going to be very interesting to see what emerges out of that space. What time then is it on the clock of the world? What I'm showing you here is Art School Day in Shandong, China. This is at the Sichuan Fine Arts Institute. Trains painters for the most part. They received 64,000 applications for 1,600 openings. This is across China, you see this now. 90% rejection rates are very common at Chinese art schools. And this is a desire for success and for financial reward. The MFA is now regarded as the second most desirable degree in China after the MBA. Now, we posed to that a recent opinion poll that showed that 24% of young Germans want to be artists. So what do we understand by this? I don't think we can understand by this that people really have suddenly decided that ceramics or sculpture or painting is the thing that they really, above all want to be. I think it's a sense that this is the one possible space that people know of, that they can imagine, in which they might be, in some sense, what we might want to determine, free. So we don't have this tension then between this form of art school and this imaginary space that perhaps does not yet exist. So in this time, what does it mean to practice free research? And I think we have to start by the very simple statement that free has to mean free. This is the current debt system as it's emerging in the UK, and I know in Germany you're not yet subject to this, but what this means is that by 2035, per capita, the UK will be as badly off in terms of student loans as the United States. In the United States now, there's $1.2 trillion of student debt. Trillion. That's a 1 followed by 12 zeros. There's more student debt than credit card debt in the United States. So it means free has to mean free. It has to mean the operations of thought and imagination without credit and the production of future debt. And what capitalism has been saying to us is that good people pay their debts. And good people respond to being granted credit by repaying them. And this morality system is a punishment system. You can see that here in these statistics. Right on the bottom it says student loans are not going to be repaid. 35% of those loans they don't expect to get back. Since this graphic was produced, a new set of statistics has come out saying that 45% of UK student loans are not being repaid. That actually means that since the student fees went up very dramatically a couple of years ago, they're now taking in less money than they were before. But nobody in any of the political parties has proposed lowering the fees or abolishing them, because this isn't about raising money. It's about creating a mentality, and it's about punishing people with the idea that whatever you undertake will lead you to being in debt. So in the beginnings of Occupy, we had this slogan, "You are not alone." And when you say it out loud, it has two meanings, obviously. You're not by yourself, and you are not shouldn't imagine yourself as a debt. And we took this into a pattern of debt resistance. We produced a document called the Debt Resisters Operations Manual, which tells you what actually happens to your debt and how, if you choose to, you can resist it. We took people into public space so they could talk about their debt, show it, and then burn it, which is what people are doing here. Took the ashes down to the East River and threw them in the river. It's a very cathartic thing to do. We took debt to Wall Street on September 17th, 2012. We occupied Wall Street, and the debt block here created a swirl of resistance to the operations of Wall Street. And all of this produced at the same time, and in relationship to this work, the Free University of New York, which takes place outside, which is really where we should be now. Beautiful out there. And without amplification, sitting in small circles, people doing skill shares, knowledge shares, creative constructions in relation to whatever it is that people want or feel that they need to learn how to learn. And Free University has continued. There was one just this past May Day in Madison Square Park, and continues to performatively explore what a free university might mean. And it's a reprise of an actually existing Free University of New York in the 1970s, which, like many of the things that Nina just mentioned, went bankrupt fairly quickly. So the current Free University tries not to use an explicitly financial system. Now, all of this has led to direct state violence in response. So this is Pussy Riot in Sochi, literally getting whipped by Cossacks. I mean, how, if you want a visible statement of state repression, this is pretty much it. Or students in the UK being driven out by police from their own university building. or the way that the New York Police Department arrested people with these plastic ties, and what they do is they tie your hands behind you really tightly. That paralyzes your hands for weeks or months to come. There's no visible damage, but you can't feel your fingers. Any form of creative labor that anybody does, from typing to operating a checkout to painting, you can't do with fingers in that condition. It's a very effective form of torture. So the state responds with violence to our suggestion that there should be things that are free. And as we know, they watch everything that we do. So they're not going to give us the chance to figure this out. That's why these places close so quickly. So we have to figure out what free practice is going to mean independently of the state, setting aside all questions of actually existing bureaucracy, because we're not the first. Throughout industrial society, in fact before, we could go back as far as the diggers of the 17th century, in every moment of slave revolt in the plantation economy around the world, there have been alternative ways of learning. And we're starting to now just respond to the last wave of resistance that began in the 60s. Just to go back quickly to Hornsey. This is an assembly that was held in Hornsey on June 21st, 1968, and you'll hopefully recognize the figure in the middle of that assembly is Buckminster Fuller. So there's an absolutely direct connection between Black Mountain and Hornsey. And as you can see, this is kind of the permanent General Assembly of Hornsey. And this was part of a radicalizing culture within London at the time. This is a journal called the International Times. It's a very sort of situationist project. You can note on the top left-hand corner the refusal to pay. So the debt was already part of the idea of resistance to consumer capitalism in the 60s. And a few weeks later, as you can see on the top of this cover, Hornsey is on the front cover. Revolution of thought and feeling is the only permanent revolution, says the International Times. And inside in its article about Hornsey, it said, at Hornsey, a microcosm of society changed totally. The people who took over had to challenge the inner organization to change its relationship with the outside world, to change themselves. Revolution of thought and feeling is the only permanent revolution. And I made a word cloud out of the different words that Hornsey used in its statements. This is a representative. And you can see the largest single word that comes out is the idea of systems, of the general, and of the world. So we then tend to think that these are ideas that are new to us. They're really not. And lower down, you'll see that one of the terms that really comes out is this question of research. What does research mean? And so when we look in Hornsey's statements, I'll just give you two excerpts from Hornsey's extensive archive. This is by a writer who was then teaching at Hornsey called Tom Nairn, who's gone on to become very well known in the UK. The time has come to try more extensive control from below, social and economic democracy. If people are not responsible enough now for real anarchy, they never will be. So a lot of the analysis of Hornsey has been around whether or not it was a properly Marxist institution at the time. People like Paul Wood and so on have kind of criticized it for not being so, but it wasn't trying to be. It was trying to be anarchic. It was trying to deal with direct forms of democracy. And in document 46, which is its educational manifesto, that was largely written by a woman called Prue Bramwell Davis, who was strongly influenced by the work of Paulo Freire that was mentioned earlier on. They thought about the ways in which permanent debate should be incorporated within higher education, that research comes to be the indispensable element to that. And this is what I have been engaged in myself and with other people more recently, to think about this project of militant research, what are we calling now free research. And militant research has its roots in feminism. It's always already feminist. So you'll see here, this is SYLVIA Pankhurst, history of the suffragette movement, that she calls the militant suffrage movement. And this is an exhibition that was at Tate Britain last year, the suffragette as militant artist. And it's not a particularly great photograph, I'm sorry, I took it with my iPhone. But if you could see this better, you would be able to see she's doing, one of the things that she did was she picked up a rock and she threw it at the portrait of the then Speaker of the House of Commons, who refused to allow women's suffrage to come up for a vote in the House. And it's interesting when we think of what we tend to do to movements after they've succeeded is deify them as being non-violent. It happened with civil rights in the US, and it's very much happened with the suffrage movement in the UK, so far as people remember it at all. But in fact, there was anything but. Militant in this point now doesn't mean violent, it means persistent. That's what she means by it. She means that they're going to continue this struggle until they get to a place where they feel that they have gained what they want. And that's exactly the same way in which Martin Luther King later used the term militant in reference to the civil rights movement in the US. The direct affiliation that we have to the idea of militant research, where we started thinking about it, was when people from Madrid came to New York and told us about the militant research that they've been doing in the city since 2006. And the group that we're particularly interested in are called Precarias a la Deriva, the precarious women in the derive. And they try and analyze a network that they see as being constituted by this tripartite body of care for the elderly, care for the young, care of all kinds, with the sex industry in its various ways, but also differentiation and discrimination by sex, and the politics of attention. And that's where creativity research and those other forms of work come in. And for Precarias, the method of research that they use is conversation. This is something we've taken from them, that you assemble people to have conversations about how they feel about the work that they're doing, the lives that they're leading, and what it is to live precariously. And you'll see that their kind of motif is this idea that militant research is the search for common ground when the common ground is shattered. And it's shattered by the dissolutions of neoliberal capital that we've been hearing about earlier this morning. So we set up in New York now the Militant Research Collective. This is a website. I have here our handbook, which we published earlier on. There are a bunch of copies over here. Please take them. The handbook was published using repurposed university money. It's distributed free. It's always free to anybody who wants it. You can also download it on the tab on the page. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. The tab, our handbook up there, you can download it as a PDF and print it out. And please feel free to use it. So within the collective at the moment, there are 3 active working groups. One around activism, particularly questions of gentrification in the current American city space, art practice, and educational practice. A militant visual culture practice centers around the idea of a connection between what I'm calling pixel work and actions. And pixels are anything you make on a computer. A word, an image, a sound, video. You know, digital images like these are not actually images, they're computations. In the same way that a sound is or a video is, anything that's generated on a machine. But then you want to link that then to a form of action, whether it's a performance, direct action, a conversation, or other form of material making. And the two together make visual activism or militant visual culture practice. So what kind of work does this involve? I'm just going to give you a few examples, and I'm aware of the pressure of time, so I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. This is a woman called Grace Lee Boggs. She lives and works in Detroit. She's now 98 years old. When this photograph was taken, she was a relatively young 95. She is what's self-described revolutionary. She worked with C.L.R. James in the city in the 50s and went through the Detroit uprising in 1967. This is a still from a film that's coming out this June called American Revolution. And she's saying in the voiceover, I feel so sorry for people who don't live in Detroit. And you can see in the background a very typical Detroit landscape of sort of abandoned, ruined factory. And what she means by this is that whether we know it or not, we all live in Detroit, which is to say a space of transition from the industrial economy to something else, from Fordism to Toyotaism. Toyotaism is when you have to not only do the work that you're told to do, you have to devise ways to improve it all the time. So the classic example that Toyota like to cite of this is their paint shops. A group of people came up with a way to reduce the number of employees in their local paint shop from 8 to 3. Toyota went great and fired a bunch of people from paint shops around the world as a result. And that's what we're all doing, right? We're figuring out ways to Toyotaize the university. At the same time, Detroit was also the home of consumer credit. First place that credit was advanced to consumers in 1919 and has now become the site of a new kind of credit war in the bankruptcy of the city. I could talk much more about that later on. But what Grace and other folks in Detroit are trying to do is what they call visionary organizing. That's organizing that thinks not about today, tomorrow, but thinks about how to make a life rather than making a living. That you plan over the span of a human life. Some of the projects they've been engaged in. This is the new K-12, that's to say kindergarten to the end of secondary school, school that's been constructed in Detroit. It's open now in a space where the state and other civic systems have essentially withdrawn, self-reliant kind of form of school. The urban farm movement that's taken a lot of hold in Detroit and other American cities. This is one called Feed 'em Freedom. And the project here is not just to grow food, although that's very necessary, but to grow community by holding blocks, by liberating territory, by being in contradiction because you have to sell some of the produce to survive through the Detroit winter, but by using space as practice and as a place to research into what is possible and how you might think towards the future. Here's the work that some artists have been doing around Detroit. This is called the Retool Kit. This is how you can get stuff made in Detroit, because there are a lot of people there with a lot of skills who don't have much to do. So if you want something made in metal or plastic or glass, you can go to this website in Detroit and figure out where this is. And this is then a kind of remapping of the city as not a space of abandonment, but as a space of skill and a space of skill share that's available to anybody that wants to try and engage with it. Now, think of all of this as taking place in what I call, borrowing from Akbar Abbas, the idea of the ex-colony. And the ex-colony is the hybrid of what we used to call the post-colonial, the neo-colonial, and the decolonial, that are all taking place at the same time. So producing this very uneven and unevenly distributed form of colonial practice at the same time as the settler colony and its long history is breaking down in various ways. So in the Militant Research Collective, we're mapping, which I think is a crucial practice of visual activism, dynamics between four corners of the ex-colony, Palestine, Detroit, Soweto, and Hong Kong. I'll just very quickly run through this. In Hong Kong, they're creating a museum called M+, which is, the plus stands for the idea that it's a museum of visual culture. They don't really know what they mean by that. What they actually are doing is things like this. This is by a Dutch artist, Florentijn Hoffman. The duck looks like it's photoshopped. It's not. It actually was a big yellow plastic duck that's floating in here in Hong Kong Harbour. It exploded quite soon after this, as apparently it often does. What is the point of this? Why is it in Hong Kong Harbour as opposed to any other harbour? I don't know. It's contemporary art. If you're in Hong Kong, though, what's happened as a result of M+ is local groups have started to say, well, what is visual culture? What does it mean to us? How would we actually construct a visual culture museum? And they started talking about assemblages of calligraphy, Hong Kong movies, vernacular architecture, street performance, street art. And they're directly opposing what's the kind of international art scene project that M+ wants to become. It's a really interesting set of dynamics. In South Africa, I just want to mention a group called the Imbawula Trust, who every June 16th stage what they call the ARTRISING. June 16th is the anniversary of the Soweto uprising of 1976, when school students decided they were no longer going to go to school as long as they were going to be taught Afrikaans and in a segregated apartheid system. They refused to learn. And the current generation, the majority young population that I referred to before, in South Africa, 65% of the population is under 30. They call themselves the Born Frees because they were born since 1994. They don't remember apartheid. So what happens is the elders, who unfortunately are people my age, who can remember 1976, hold memory circles with young people, talk to them about what happened, but it's not just simply a kind of performance then. Well then, after the memory circle, there's a collective art making that might involve music, it might involve street art, it might involve video, depending on what each circle decides that it wants to do. And there are two kind of projects here. One is a kind of an attempt to make the revolution continue. The other is to create autonomy within Soweto, a system that's largely been abandoned by the government. And the third thing is to show to the Born Free generation that there are actually opportunities for them above and beyond the things that the current system makes visible to them. I wonder if this link is going to work. Let's see. So this is MTL. This is a photo video collective that works in and around Occupy. And one of the ways of thinking about militant research is as scholarly or artistic reporting. So in Palestine, we've been able to do a series of collages like this. This is a collage, and each of these points links you to a set of video or text about Palestine, and then the text underneath explain the general rubric of what's going on. So here then the artist and activist is creative reporter. It's militant research as scholarly research. There's a lot more obviously I can say about this. I need to go back to PowerPoint. Thank you. So most recently, we got a couple of projects going. One that Jael mentioned at the beginning, this is after Occupy, where we had assembled people in conversations to talk about what Occupy meant to the people who were directly involved in it. We record those conversations that we made available online. I know, two more slides. And it's conversations, militant research. And then very finally, the global ultra luxury faction, Gulf. We weren't going to the Guggenheim Museum, which is building a new museum for itself in Abu Dhabi. It's a geary monstrosity, 140,000 square feet of air-conditioned metal in the middle of a 130-degree desert. And we've been asking who builds the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. It's mostly migrant labor from South Asia who come into those jobs in the Khalifa system where they have to pay an overseer in order to be allowed to migrate into the museum system. There's a lot more I can say about this. I'll just quickly say we've been back to the museum a couple of times. Here's a projection that we did outside the 1% Museum, and most recently threw petrodollars into the lot again, into the spiral from the upper loops. So, in conclusion, this is step one in making the road by walking it. This is a Zapatista idea. Small is beautiful because we need to work at smaller scale to end the biocide, but also because it's in the small that we can work this out. Scale is not our question yet. Scale is a question we can deal with later. Accreditation is not yet required. We may not even be in a system where there is accreditation. We don't want to create a Toyotaist knowledge academy, right? And the solution to the dominant issues of things like employment is not to be found within the university, it's to be found in a different kind of politics that will do around the living wage, which is the last remaining demand of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and the stipulations of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that housing, healthcare, and education are rights, not goods. And so the goal in all of this is abolition. Abolition of the credit system and the institution of abolition democracy. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Nick. what you were planning on presenting today, and I was really impressed to get an impression about how things have changed also in terms of the academic climate, and especially in New York City, since I was there 3 or 4 years ago. And also as a statement from my point of view as a teacher here, there is really for me, considerable difference in the, let's say, mentality or the thinking about politics and academia and politics in the US, or as you described it, or in New York City in particular, and here in, I would say, in Germany. So also I want to use your talk as an opportunity to talk about differences, also because your talk made very clear to me, reflecting on Black Mountain, what are the big differences to those movements, academic movements, and also attempts to create new institutions or rethink collaborative work or research or whatever in comparison to today. Because one crucial point for me also doing my research and also the research with the students about Black Mountain is that even though it was, as Hans Friedrich said in the morning, it was an own epoch, it was in a time with the Second World War, with the exile, his history of exile, with the post-war world, where it itself was fairly unpolitical. It had, if you read the bulletins and if you see the statements of the students and the teachers, it didn't have a rhetoric or an explicitly political agenda, even though they practiced something which we would consider as very different from the current ideologies or practices in the established institutions. And I want to raise the question, and it's very peculiar. Also, if you look back at the Bauhaus history, which had a very political agenda in its time, it was also very much in a very hostile political environment. In its time, and the closure of it also tells a vivid story of that. And all of this, with all the documents, there were some side remarks that we have to educate our people in war times and give them strength, etc., but it was marginal. It was marginal also from the people who taught there and who were in exile. They didn't reflect, they were less political, I would say, at Black Mountain in this rhetorical sense than Thomas Mann. He at least had his, radio talks to Germany and his statements as the Betrachtung eines Unpolitischen. But the word politics or an agenda like that just didn't exist. And that's very phenomenal also in terms of the history of knowledge, that you have an institution which is basically revolutionizing everything, you can think of in terms of hierarchies, in terms of working together, in terms of what you said before, authorship, in its time, without that kind of rhetoric agenda or, emphatic understanding of, let's say, changing the world. This kind of rhetoric or this kind of attempt or this agenda or writing a manifesto, which was so important for all the other followers later, that you can actually reconstruct the history of these institutions, interestingly enough, in some ways through the actions, but the actions kind of followed, in most cases, the manifesto. Also, if you look at what you said in the beginning, the suffragette movement or the other movements, they all started out, before the actions took place, they started out with a manifesto of one or the other ideological kind. And you don't have, basically, you have hardly any manifesto. You have memories or personal accounts or statements or even ironic comments by teachers like Albers, referring once to Klee, who was a Bauhaus teacher and had a very strong pedagogical impact, saying, I developed a pedagogical concept, but I never used it. And so this is very intriguing to me, to see all these, kind of conceptualized, verbalized, from various strains, from anarchy to neo-Marxism. There's all kinds of strains in the history of ideas of a legitimization of those kind of actions or movements, and that's very interesting. And the only parallel I would see to the doing. Through the doing is really, and that's in contrast maybe to the movement in the US, where the recent uprisings for instance, in Turkey or in the Arabic countries, where people just out of simple actions by, blogging or by using cell phones, etc., created a dynamic out of doing things rather than out of a fixed or a conceptualized ideology. And that would be my, my question also for the audience, how we can, somehow explain, for me at least, explain the functioning or the working or the evolvement of so many avant-gardists we now call or label them as neo-avant-gardistic or avant-gardistic practices at this college without such a base.
Do you want me to reply to that?
You can answer. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what I think is, when I'm listening to you talk here, what strikes me, I think, is the difference of immigrant cultures in the US in the period of Black Mountain to where we are now. I mean, it seems really clear that what's happening is a group of people who are very aware of what they're doing, but are not going to say so out loud. And you can see this very clearly in the Susan Phillips installation that we saw yesterday at the Hamburger Bahnhof, where, Eisler is investigated by the FBI, and why were you working in the Soviet Union? Oh, I don't know, I just thought I would go. Why were you working with Bert Brecht? I just happened to bump into him. I mean, this is obviously not true. This is obviously not what he thinks. But he's going to say that to avoid being deported, which is a perfectly sensible and reasonable thing to do if your alternative is being, sent back to Nazi Europe. I think the distinction now is that one of the things we really saw in Occupy was the refusal of immigrants to be quiet. I mean, the core of what happened in Jakarta, the core of the people working there were people who are not from or native to the US. From Argentina, from Spain, from Greece, from Italy, from the UK, from Mexico, from India, and I'm just going around the people that I happen to know. So, you see that quite widely, I think, now in the US with the DREAM Act and other, students coming out saying, I'm undocumented, but I'm not illegal. I demand the right to be educated. So there's a kind of direct politics around that. And in the same way the Occupy went from action to manifesto, that the occupation happened, and then it was like, well, let's make a declaration of why we're here. Which was done in open assembly. So, I mean, I think that distinction is very much to do with that. It's that question of the transformation of immigrant politics, and I think it is also, frankly, it's about what you're not going to say in North Carolina and plantation culture in 1937 or 1951, because that's a place where, the kind of resort to violence that I was talking about here is immediate. It's not going to go through any channels. This is a period in which lynching is still an active practice, right? So people are going to very reasonably be cautious about what they can say out loud, and that, so when you talk about Clay saying, I had a pedagogy that I didn't implement, I know exactly what he's talking about. And I think the whole point of what happened since 2011 is for people to say, this is actually a point at which I can't do that anymore. That I can't compromise the fact that I might get deported, like I might very well get deported, because it's just we have a kind of global system from which there is no outside. So you might as well try it.
Question. John.
Yeah, thank you both very much for introducing a new set of questions. And I think I would just like to add another question concerning the periodization of Black Mountain against the background of the politicized dynamics of reclaiming a certain right to not only make a living but make a life. Because it is indeed a very interesting observation that there was no political agenda, no explicit political agenda in a time that we normally consider to be highly politicized, totalitarian almost, even, you know, the US was sketched as a somewhat totalitarian system by Bruno Horkheimer, for instance. And then there are spaces in which it seemed to still have been possible to think of alternative life forms without explicitly making them political. I mean, one vocabulary that would allow us to rethink this periodization of, you know, the formerly totalitarian and now the liberal situation would be the one that is also introduced or suggested by Negri and Hart, yeah, speaking about the passage from the formal subsumption of all kinds of subjectivity, in fact, to the real subsumption of that, which I think also alludes to some of the things that Nina Muntmann has emphasized. I mean, this is just a set of associations, but I would like to hear more about a periodization of subjectivity, actually, and the machineries of producing it in these respects.
And it also puts into question, you know, when we're referring also with the aim of the exhibition is also to include the strain of the Bauhaus tradition. It's not to claim that there was a European tradition or something like that, but it's a question how we can re-periodize modernism, essentially. You know, because we have those clear, you know, also when we teach about it, we have those clear cuts, you know, between pre-war, wartime, after wartime, etc. And I think Black Mountain is also, in a way, making us think about what you said in the beginning. How can we rethink those periodizations, you know, and where and how do we have to think also, or we have to rethink our thinking of origins of something, because that what bothers me most is also in the history, the writing of the history of performance art. You can still encounter cliches like, oh, this was the origin, or this was the untitled event is the myth of the origin of the happening culture, which was initially, and you still find it, it's taught like that. But there, I mean, it would be much more interesting to think, how can we think without, that we mark a set of, you know, events and situations and constellations rather than, you know, referring to it in a more linear way. And this kind of non-linear pattern of time is also reflected in what we also heard today in the various formats of time they used. I mean, their lack of structure was also a kind of implicit refusal to kind of use time in a rational way. Like, let's say a class has to start and end at this time, or the summer school is always for a week, or a professor has to teach this and that long, or a student has to be there for that period of time. So time was as malleable there as all the other structures. And still, what amazes us, that this lack of structure and kind of cliched form of rational organization has led to such a tremendous output, or at least, you know, initiated a lot of, you know, developments, and also what one would call today Nachhaltigkeit. Where is it in sustainability? We always talk about sustainability, development, and all these. We try to you know, kind of establish those time forms, and that was the formats, you know, were you know, taken in that form, basically broken free from that usual rational organization of time. And I think rethinking that from how they used the time and how they built the slots of working together also gives way to, you know, rethink that periodical aspect.
Well, we want to do something else too, which is to say that periodization that we done, I mean, this thing of this very typically academic gesture of going back and finding something to recuperate, also needs to be set into the context of, in the Anthropocene, there is no time. You know, geologically, 1750 to the present is an infinitesimal speck of geological time in which we transform the deep time of the planet. And so the use of industrial design as a motif, you know, in an agricultural setting needs to be rethought in that context. Let's do very quickly to the Hart and Negri point. I absolutely agree with what you just said. And Michael Hart's introduction to the MTL cartography talks about the de-exceptionalizing of spaces like Palestine. In other words, which is my point about Detroit. We're all in Detroit. We're all in Palestine. And that, again, would, I think, want to sort of make us think about a kind of a different speciality alongside this different temporality that we now need to work in.
One final question, because we have to stop, otherwise I have to say, we don't get lunch at the restaurant. I think we won't come. Is there any one? Yeah.
I have only a comment, just because I never thought about this thing you mentioned, that Bauhaus and Black Mountain College, that it was not politicized or spoken of with in political terms. The Dadaists I would come up with as a group which didn't form obviously some sort of institution at all, no? But I would point out different, like historically different movements which did use political terms or hidden political terms, but they in the end were not a school or not trying to. But there it was possible, and it was very informal of something like Cabaret.
Thank you very much.